So I wanted to make, before I look at the future, I want to look at some historical perspectives with regard to where we are. And these might seem very common sense, but they're seldom articulated. And it's more to do with sociology rather than the ecumenism. And it's really this, that until round about the mid-50s, there was a consistency in the way in which people met in churches, irrespective of the denomination. And the local church was all important. Until the mid-50s, the local church, whether that was a Catholic church or a congregational church or a Baptist church or an independent, it was a local church. And people would go there, would walk there. There's a huge big church in Preston near the railway station. I forget the name of it. It's a Catholic church. It's very ornate inside. There's angels flying all over the place inside. And one night I was asked to go and do some music there to raise money for L'Arche. And I was delighted to go there, but rather disappointed with the journey up from Manchester. It was in a rickety old train, and it was very cold. And by the time I got into this church, I was looking forward to availing myself of the gents' convenience. And I said to the priest when I met him, before I start, can you show me where there's a toilet? And he looked a bit surprised. And he said, well, yes, yeah, okay. So he took me right to the front of the church, and there was a lady much older than me who was about to go into the only toilet in the building, and he said, do you mind letting the speaker in first? So I was very privileged that the lady had assented without accident. And then I thought, here's a church in which there could gather for Mass on a Sunday morning 500 people, and there's only one toilet. But that church was built to serve the Catholic population who lived nearby, who would walk to the church. There's no need for a toilet. There are plenty of churches in Scotland where there is no toilet at all. They're in rural areas where people would walk from the village there and back. That was the presumption. It's a gathered community of people who are local. And the second presumption was that everyone knew everyone else, or most people would know most other people. If you lived in a rural community or in a mining community or an industrial community, by and large, you'd know the people around you. You'd have shared the same shops. Your kids would have gone to the same school. You would see each other face to face in the street 6 days a week. So you could sit facing the front and see the back of each other's necks without any difficulty. You'd already seen the faces. You were glad to see the back of them for 1 hour on a Sunday. And we did that, and we would know. I can remember St Andrew's North Church, in which I grew up. I can remember nearly all the people who went there, and there would be maybe 200 or 300 on a Sunday morning. And I knew most of these people by sight because it was the local community. And part of the reason why I stayed in the church was because as a child, I could be in the front street in Kilmarnock, a town of 50,000 people, and somebody would stop me and say, you're John Bell, and I would say, yes. And they'd say, well, we're Mr. and Mrs. MacDonald, and we go to St Andrew's North like your mum and dad and tell them we're asking for them. That sense of belonging and that sense of knowing each other because you had a shared story, you lived in the same place and you knew each other's faces. And the third thing was that many churches were community hubs, that they weren't just there for worship, although that was the primary cause for them being there, but there were ancillary things which were significant for the whole community. And that would range from being places where there was children's work and youth work, whether that was Sunday schools or whether it was Scouts or Guides or Boys Brigade or whatever other organisation or the YMCA. They used these premises. They were important. They allowed sporting ventures to happen. Many of our post-1950s churches in Scotland were built according to the possibilities of a badminton court, partly because it was always the hall, which was the church, allegedly, which was built first, but it would be used for other activities until the hall was built. And so it had to be big enough so that those who were badminton aficionados could play their game. I mean, a sport which involves so few people and yet takes up so much space. And other recreational activities like singing, people joining choirs or church choirs, that happened within the halls. And there would be gender-specific meetings, a women's group or a men's group, or a mothers and toddlers group. Because the facility was there and the church was keen that it be used, it was able to use that facility for the benefit of the community. So that was the thing, you know, and occasionally you might use the church for a political meeting. One of the churches I worked in Glasgow when I was a student, there was a big outbreak of violence in the local community. It was the time when there were gangs and people being knifed and having their bodies marked all over the place, and we called a meeting of the local community to discuss how you dealt with street violence and what we would do with young people who were attracted to gangs. And so the church hall, it was a big place, and we could gather 200 people in there quite happily. So the sense of the physical building being a hub for the whole community was prevalent right until maybe the end of the 50s and to some extent thereafter. And there was a common assent within churches of worship and song, that by and large, if you went to a Roman Catholic church, you knew exactly what would happen in the Mass. And there would be a diet of songs, of plain song chanting and of hymns of devotion, which you would sing in the Mass. If you went to an Anglican church, then there was an Anglican liturgy or an Episcopal liturgy in Scotland, and it was unchanging. And you'd use hymns ancient and modern or the English hymnal according to the preference of the parish priest. If you went to a Presbyterian or a Congregational church, then it was usually 2 hymns and 2 prayers and a sermon, or 5 hymns and 2 prayers and 2 readings and a sermon and an offering. It was a pattern which was consistent. And Father knew best, whether the priest was called Father or whether he was called Reverend. He knew best, and he did most of the things, and people were obedient to that. And that was where we were in the 50s. I remember that vividly because we had a German couple my father had met during the war who came to Kilmarnock in the early 1960s, and they were able to go to Mass, although they didn't speak English very well, but they could go to Mass and they understood exactly how things would happen. It was much the same as in their village near Cologne. And then in the 50s, there are a couple of things which are relatively unspoken about, but which were very significant. And one was the advent of the private car as an appropriate vehicle for transportation. It happened first of all in America with Henry Ford, and then it came into Britain, and gradually cars began to proliferate in our streets. Street I grew up in, 52 houses, I think 3 people had a car in the 1950s. But when I went back there 20 years later, almost every house had a car sitting outside it. Not that there weren't any buses, and not that it was a far distance from the town centre, but that had just happened. And of course, one of the things that happens when you have public transport is not just that people can go other places on a Sunday, but that people can choose to go to the church of their choice rather than the church which is closest to them. And particularly in non-Catholic denominations, people, if you were to look in a big city or a big town at where people live and where they go to church, it would be like the London Underground, as people change places. And they'll choose to go to this church because this is where my wife went as a child and I quite like, and it's good for her. Or to this place because they have a better children's programme. Or to this place because they have a robed choir and they sing Haydn Masses once a month. Or to this place because they've a great praise band and they've all got new material and they've got screens up. And so people go according as much to taste, to cultural taste, as to any proximity with the other people who gather. And the result is that when we go to church, not so much in rural areas, but in urban areas certainly, when we go to church, to say that we are a congregation is a misnomer. To say that we are an audience is sometimes near the mark, particularly where there is no other point of engagement for most of the congregation. There's no meeting in the street, there's no talking in the supermarket. The second thing is the television. And this is not for a moment to deride its significance or its importance to people. But when the television came along, and there are studies which have been done in this, there's a particularly interesting book published in the late 80s called Amusing Ourselves to Death by an American sociologist. And what he does is to indicate how television, which has become the predominant way in which people understand or learn about truth or about the world, what's going on, that it is a It is something which needs to keep changing the image in order to keep your attention. Now, people who are my age and older, of whom there are very few here, might remember that in the 60s there was a programme called the Brains Trust. And the Brains Trust was a kind of intellectual Sunday evening conversation between people like Margarita Laskin, Lady Isabel Barnett, and Gilbert Harding, and Professor Bronowski. And there might be a question put to this group of intellectuals, such as, do you think that China will ever go to war with its neighbours because there is insufficient land to produce food to feed its people? And Bronowski, you would watch him, and he would maybe speak not to camera, but to the other people for 2 or 3 minutes. And in the course of trying to come up with an answer, he might change his mind. He might say on the one side and on the other side. And the others would listen to him. And then they would offer their opinion. And there's a sense in which there was a measured conversation by people of intellect, which showed the complexity of a situation as it dawned on the minds of those who were in the discussion. Now look at question time now. I mean, the person has hardly begun to answer the question when somebody's shouting from the audience and the camera turns to this disconcerted person, or someone else wants to intervene. And it's all soundbite. There's no measured conversation or argument. If you look at the length of advertisements now, this book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, would indicate that the average shot, the time of a shot, is about 4 seconds. And then it has to move. And so rather than have Moira Anderson advertising electric cookers and singing some ballad as she does this, and the camera just watches her as she goes through the electricity showroom, touching all these as if they were venerable creatures, not now. Now there's going from one to the other, back and forward, back and forward, back and forward. And what that does to the attention span of people is not really well charted, except that we know that in the past, in the pre-war era, and perhaps to some extent after it, if people went to a place where someone was speaking, they would come with the expectation they would sit for a while and give of their listening. Not of their looking, but give of their listening. My grandfather was a communist. And in the 1930s, he went to the Workers' Educational Society in Kilmarnock. They would bring a professor from Glasgow to talk about developments in biology, or another professor to speak about discoveries in geography or archaeology. And working men miners would go there expecting that for an hour this person would give a lecture on something about which he, because it nearly always was a he, was passionate. And they would come expecting that their minds would be filled, and they would talk about this thereafter when they went back to their families. I don't know, according to your tradition, how long people will preach in church. I mean, mine's is about 20 minutes, if you're lucky. 12 minutes in an Anglican church, maybe about 6 in a Catholic church. It depends on the culture of the place. But the notion that one person speaking will hold the attention of those whose understanding of communication has been conditioned by watching television or constantly flicking on their phone to see what else they can find as they have a 2-minute journey in the underground is something which we have to be concerned about. And the state, since the 50s, has taken over a number of the things that used to happen within the church. I mean, the church used to be the place where people would go who were impoverished, and a benevolent fund or the priest's private fund or something else might give people some financial assistance. But now with a welfare state and with a provision for people who are unemployed, that kind of thing has taken away from the centrality of the church to do poor relief. And we have schools which now have open playing fields or open facilities which are much better than church halls in which to play badminton or tennis or do a whole range of other things. And a plethora of youth organisations which are not necessarily connected with any Christian church and don't need our halls. And we have a move, and I won't dwell on this, within the music of the church, which has become, in some places, very commercial, where you have a kind of range of superstars within the worship and praise galaxy, each of whom will produce an album which is very well produced, which will become the surrogate song of the church. People will listen to this rather than actually engage in the song. I remember when I was a boy at school hearing Benjamin Britten's St. Nicholas, partly because the school choir was doing it. And if you listen to that recording when Britten's conducting it sometime around 1965, the tenors and basses are all over the place. But they recorded it, and it was produced. If you listen to some early Beatles recordings, they aren't all perfect. You know, Ringo Starr was never exactly the world's best drummer, but usually he kind of gets it, sometimes he doesn't. But at that time, performance was not everything. It was introducing people to music which they might emulate and sing on their own. But the performance culture now means that the church choir singing Forey's Requiem will be nothing like King's College, because they have the pristine sound, and we're not going to listen to the drivel coming from the church choir. We've been conditioned to that, and conditioned within many churches not to being a participative community which offers song to God, but a performance community which listens to those who can do it best, and we will move our feet and perhaps move our bodies in sync with them. And we've come to a time now when there is an increasing vocal laity in some places, particularly over women's issues, when people who have long been silenced because of their gender have begun to speak up and ruffle the feathers of the male hierarchy who've been in control. Now, these are developments which have happened in the 1950s, or after the 1950s. And I don't know that we've embraced the consequences, but for me the big consequence is whether we who gather in our churches are a community or whether we are an audience. And the hierarchy and those who are ordained or trained as leaders, by and large, have a training which is still in the old model of everyone gathered who knows each other. That's the presumption in worship. That's the presumption when we gather. And so we teach them or we instruct them in a society for which that is no longer maybe always the most appropriate thing.